All right. Hello, students, and welcome back to macroeconomics. We're in module 38, which is about productivity and growth. Um, the previous model, we were still talking about the ideas of long run economic growth, and we will continue to talk about economic growth today. We're going to talk about the changes in productivity and the aggregate production function. Um, we've talked about the production possibility frontier from beginning of the school year, beginning of the semester, and we're going to build upon that basic idea. Um, and we're going to also then talk a little bit about this convergence hypothesis that we see some countries doing better than others and why. So we'll take the accounting for growth, and we'll look at about natural resources. We'll look at issues, successes, disappointments, and failures in economic growth. About several different key areas throughout the world. So let's go ahead and dig in. So we have this thing called accounting for growth, the aggregate production function. It's this hypothetical function that shows how productivity, or real GDP per worker, depends upon three things. Depends upon the amount of physical capital that is available for each worker, how much human capital that each worker has, and then the overall technological advancements that is happening in a particular country also play a huge role in their overall production. So we'll take a look at that. So realistically, we can say that if there is more physical capital, like machines, allows for more production. Just like if I own a business, and the more machines I have, theoretically, if there are machines that are usable for me, and I have workers to use them, I should be able to produce more. And then human capital, the amount of knowledge or skill sets that we have, and then the advancements in technology. We know uh, the levels of technology, the higher technological advances we have, the better off we are. Okay. So when we take a look, a recent example of the aggregate production function applied to real data from China and India, showing some of their economic growths. And we had the economists Barry Bosworth and Susan Collins from the Brookings Institute, and they looked at the following. They essentially said that we could look at the GDP per worker, not GDP per capita. The GDP per worker is essentially T, meaning the estimate level of technology, times the physical capital per work raised to the 0.4, and times the human capital per worker raised to the 0.6. This is an important microeconomics concept that also applies to the aggregate production function. We know that there's diminishing returns to physical capital. All else equal, as physical capital is increased, aggregate output increases, but by a smaller amount. That's like that stage two of growth. We know we have that idea of increasing total product at a decreasing rate. Okay, that's essentially what we're saying is happening. Okay, so using that function, they tried to figure out why China grew faster than India in the periods of 1978 to 2004. Okay, why did they have so much more growth? Um, and when we think of this idea of growth, um, in reality, everything is changing at once. Like there's so many things that are happening, and we try to look at um, the amount of investment. Like we look at like China, they had about half the difference was due to the amount of investment spending, which raised its level of physical capital. So when we have that investment, that I part of the GDP, C plus I plus G plus net exports, that I is huge. because we invest, we build factories, we build machinery, we build and buy those capital things that supposedly, and innovation is part of that. Um, Huge amounts of innovation that China had is why they grew so fast. Now, we can look at some innovation as it's kind of hard. Like as a teacher, we've had huge amounts of innovation in the 20 plus years that I've been teaching, but we still see a certain amount. The older teachers took a while to transition to more digital. Even though the digital and the new technology was out there to use digital things, it took a really long time for us to transition into that digital facet. It's there, but it just takes a while for people to finally make that part of their everyday life. Okay. But now, not all technology is good. Like today, we have huge amounts of new technology in our cell phones and all that. But once again, those new technologies, in certain aspects, some students, what do? They sit and play on their phone. Granted, they have a lot of knowledge right there at their fingertips, but they spend their time looking at TikToks or Vines or videos, YouTube videos, and not learning other things that might help them. They rather look at stupid, silly videos. So that takes away a little bit from their growth of human capital. So we know that this aggregate production function, right? And the production function we know is this growth that we're having has this diminishing returns to physical capital. Holding the amount of human capital and the technology fixed, we've seen certain amounts of increase because of physical capital. But once again, it's the law of diminishing marginal returns. So if we take a look here, we could see that when we talk about physical capital, when we go to no physical capital to real GDP, so we have a $15,000 physical capital inlay or input, we get a 30,000 real GDP output. Okay, but then when we go up to 30,000, well, we only go up to 45,000. And then when we go up another 15,000 here, we only get a $10,000 or increase in real GDP per capita for the workers. So once again, we with physical capital investment, we don't get an exponential. It's not like we put in $10,000 worth of physical capital and all of a sudden the GDP per capita per worker goes up, by 10 times. We don't see that. We see a growth, but over time it's a diminishing growth. Okay, so we want to see how this looks. So this graph shows that an increasing amount of input causes an increasing amount of output, but not at a constant rate. So here is productivity, right? Here is our production, our aggregate production function. Okay. So as we go on the horizontal axis, as we put in more physical capital per worker, we get an increase in real GDP. So this is essentially giving us the potential to produce more. And when we think about this is talking about the growth, and hopefully we're talking then about the long run aggregate supply curve is moving towards the right. So here's our GDP. If there's a P1 or PC one amount of physical capital, and as we put more physical capital in, we get GDP grows, and we see it starting to grow at a decreasing rate. Okay, right here it's growing at an increasing rate, then it's growing at a decreasing rate. This is kind of like a stage 2, and eventually it possibly hit a stage 3. But productivity levels off because of diminishing returns. All right, so we need new skills. We need new the human capital, and we need new technology to make us our productivity to increase. Okay, so here it is again, kind of with some numbers here, so you can see the increasing the real GDP per worker is getting smaller as we have a large set of increase in physical capital. Okay, So we have this idea of this growth accounting. In reality, everything is changing at once. Economists try to estimate the impact estimate the impact different factors have on the growth with a technique called this growth accounting. When other important factors like human capital, technology increase, and aggregate production function shifts upward, this tells us for any given level of physical uh, uh, capital per worker, total production has increased. So economists try to measure higher total factor productivity, meaning the amount of output um, that can be produced with a given amount of factor inputs. So when total factor productivity increases, the economy can produce more output with the same quantity of physical capital, human capital, and labor. So we can get a greater output per person. This is showing us growth. Okay. When we think about this, the amount of physical capital uh, per worker grows about 3% per year, according to estimates uh, of the aggregate production function. Each 1% in physical capital per worker holding human capital and technological constant raises output per worker about a third of 1%. Okay. So we don't see that drastic increase. We have to raise human and technology up to have that continued growth. Okay. Um, the total factor productivity is the amount of output that can be achieved with a given amount of factors. Factor inputs. So that's like limiting, that's that production possibility frontier that's limiting our amount. And we know from our production possibility frontier from back in, I don't know, what was that, like module 2 or 3, maybe 3, that there's a limit to what we can do. We have to increase that to get a greater amount of productivity. So once again, here we see in this graph right here, we see we go from the 1940 productivity to 2010. Okay, technological progress shifts the productivity curve upward. Here we're holding human capital, per worker fixed. We assume the lower curve, reflects technology the earlier times, and the upper curve reflects more recent, 2010. Holding technology and human capital fixed, quadrupling physical capital, you know, quadrupling going from here to here, just raising physical capital would take us from here to here, right? From A to C, right? That would take us from A to C. But getting us by increasing the other, the human and the technological capital will have us a greater shift upward. So just using physical capital slides us from A to C, but having that increase in uh, 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 getting us from let's say A to D, um, we have we're using more growth, more available things to allow us to grow, such as that human and technological advancements. So we're trying to raise the productivity levels. So there's other things we have to take into account too. You know, um, when we think about our productivity, we have to look at our certain natural resources because we everything is scarce, right? So other things being equal, countries with abundant natural resources, let's say like Kuwait in oil reserves or the United States in fertile land, they tend to have a higher real GDP per capita than less fortunate countries that don't have as abundant resources, that maybe not as wealthy, that don't have the big resources of oil or fertile land or other kinds of iron ore. So natural resources were very important to economic growth when there were vast territories that remained undeveloped. As we know that manifest destiny in America, as North America became more populous, fertile farmland and timber and mineral resources played a huge role in the growth of the U.S. and Canada. But once the arable land was planted and natural resources were harvested, the role of natural resources diminished and the role of physical capital, human capital, and technological capital increased. Okay, so clearly, a nation that overexploits or pollutes its natural resources cannot enjoy much long run growth, but the actual possession of many natural resources has become less important in the aggregate function. So here we can see the issue here. This is an informational technological paradox, and this is economists were puzzled why we had such a slowdown in the 70s and 80s with technology, and this is where I was talking about before, where a lot of people were so used to doing things a certain way that they weren't embracing the new technology, which then really slowed down the growth rate of our productivity. Okay, here we see some things that we're going to talk about. The growth rates of why they vary in different regions. Okay, and we see them varying here in different regions. The real GDP per capita from 1960 to 2000 or 2012 in $2005 are shown here. We see Argentina, South Korea, and Nigeria. South Korea and other East Asian countries have been highly successful in achieving economic growth, where Argentina, like much of Latin America, has had several setbacks slowing its growth, and Nigeria's standard of living in 2012 was only barely higher than it had been in the 1960s, an experience shared by many other countries in Africa. So we're going to take a look at that right now. So, you know, different countries achieve different growth rates. Okay, when we look at East Asia, since 1975, the whole region of East Asia has increased the real GDP per capita by over 6% per year, three times the American historical growth rate. Um, how have some of these Asian countries achieved such a high rate? Well, the answer is really that all of their sources of productivity growth have been firing on all cylinders. They have very high savings rates, a relatively large percentage of GDP that is saved nationally in any given year has allowed the countries to significantly increase the amount of physical capital per workers, so more physical capital. Very good basic education, so that improves human capital. And the countries have experienced substantial technological progress. So Asia has done very well for that. Okay. The East Asian experience demonstrates that economic growth can be especially fast in countries that are playing catch up. So countries that are kind of behind, they're in that catch up stage. So, on this basis, many economists have suggested a general principle known as the convergence hypothesis, in saying that differences in real GDP per capita among countries tend to narrow over time because countries start to lower real GDP per capita, tend to have higher growth rates. Okay, a little bit of a herding type of thing. Now, Latin America, they've been a little more of a disappointment. Okay, since the 1920s, growth in Latin America has been pretty disappointing. The fact that South Korea is now much richer than Argentina have been inconceivable. A long time ago, because we think of all of the natural resources in places like Argentina. So when we compare that, the rates of saving and investment spending in Latin America have been much lower than like Asia. Um, Irresponsible government policies that have eroded their savings, had high inflation, bank failures. Their education, especially broad basic education, has been underemphasized. Latin American nations, rich in natural resources, have often failed oops, sorry about that, have often failed to channel that wealth into their educational system. So those natural resources and that money from that haven't been put into education. And really, the political instability leading to irresponsible economic policies have really taken a role in why Latin America is so disappointing. And then we have places like Africa, where the real GDP per capita in sub Saharan Africa actually fell by 13% in 1980 to 1994, although it has recovered. Um, Poor growth performance has been intensified and continuing, and they continue to have poverty. Several of the factors to this problem is uh, first and foremost is the problems of political instability. In the years since 1975, large parts of Africa have been experiencing savage civil wars. They've been killing millions of people and made productive investment spending impossible. The threat of war and general anarchy in some areas um, have really hurt their educational system and their infrastructure. Property rights have also been a problem. The lack of legal safeguards for owners to have their money or have their property, to use those natural resources, along with government corruption, have really been a problem. Um, Especially, this is especially damaging in countries that are very poor. So that has been a real problem. So when we think about this, well, many economists see this political instability and the government corruption as a leading cause of underdeveloped countries in Africa. Um, some people believe will argue that Africa is politically unstable because Africa is poor, not the other way. Where some people say because it's poor, they have political corruption. Other people say because of the poverty, that the political instability because of the poverty. Um, where others say it's the other way, that the poor government has led to the poverty. Um, Africa's poverty, people can claim, stem from the extremely unfavorable geographic conditions, such as certain areas being landlocked, hot, tropical diseases, uh, poor soil. Um, we know in general, poor countries, worker productivity is often severely hampered by malnutrition and disease. Uh, Tropical areas get malaria, and there's health issues and infrastructure. We know that economists are studying certain regions of Africa to determine whether modest amounts of aid given directly to residents for the purpose of increasing crop yields and reducing malaria, increasing school attendance, would be something to help the sustainable living. Okay, so that's something to think about. Now, like we said, we also see economists believing this idea of convergence hypothesis, that when we look and we take into the infrastructure and favorable things, that we could take a look and we see convergence among healthy countries versus the rest of the world, and we see that there are countries that are doing essentially better. We see that if we look at the graph on the left, countries that are more successful with their growth rate, uh, they're more similar in their structures. Where countries that are struggling to have a good growth rate, um, they are not, they're more spread out in their use of money. They're more inconsistent in their use of money. So once again, we've talked about East Asia and we talked about Latin America and Sub-Sahara. And once again, East Asia, we've seen that growth. Latin America, the instability, poor education. Sub-Sahara, we see the war and poor infrastructure that led to the failure of economic growth. So once again, when we take a look at the economic growth of these countries, we're looking at the aggregate production function and how much the three factors of of human capital, physical capital, and technology help countries grow. We know there's a certain amount of diminishing returns on physical capital. So we need those additional productivities, right? We need to have more human capital, more technological advances to get that growth rate to prosper, or to shift that, to get that aggregate long run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. All right. And we know that some countries are really struggling in that point. When we look at overall prices falling, some countries, they have what they call deflation, right? And that is something that these countries have to be concerned with. Um, we want there to be an increase in aggregate demand. We want people to be able to buy more, to have more, and that will cause the a natural inflationary rate. So deflation is not what we're looking at if we're looking at overall growth, because there is a certain amount, because everything is scarce. Okay. So with that being said, let's take a look at worksheet 38.1, which is a PBS. If you go to the video or go to the link, it takes you to a page, and then there's a video in there. And then if you go ahead and you answer the following questions, number one says, what is China's largest textile factory doing to protect the environment? The workers at the factory are recycling water, lowering energy use. The factory has a power plant that uses the stream for heating. Okay. Um, China's economy is the second largest in the world. Why might its rapid economic growth be at odds with the environment? Well, coal has made China the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases, and the region suffers from air and water pollution due to this coal use. There are weeks where people don't see a blue sky in certain parts of China because of all the factories. Um, what is China doing to promote growth without impacting the environment? China has started recycling metal and paper. They've also have an environmental health and safety academy that trains managers on health and environmental issues. Um, and then, why aren't government regulations effective at reducing pollution in China? Well, the fines imposed are less than the cost of installing pollution reduction machinery, so they'll just keep polluting because they're not penalized enough. So, in the long run, an increase in savings will generally do what? That will see increase the rate of economic growth, because the savings will then lead to additional, that's loanable funds, and those loanable funds will reduce the interest rates. Well, then more people, more businesses will want to invest in their company. Okay. Investment in human capital shifts the aggregate production function where? That's E, upward. So we'll get more GDP per capita with that, with the human capital. If technology advances, then what will happen? More output can be attained from the same input. So we can get more from the same. So we're once again increasing productivity. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for Module 38. Hope you're all doing well. See you soon. Stay safe.